I'm Amisha. I'm one of the copywriters at WEvolve.
Mhm.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is
Not
Amrita.
ma'am.
I'm also one of the
If you call me ma'am, I will have to reciprocate with Amrita ma'am. How are you doing today? So if you're okay with that, then you can call me ma'am. It's not a problem.
no. Okay, good afternoon, Kohinoor. I'm Amrita and I'm also one of the copywriters at Wevolve.
Let's-
Okay, so if everything's good on our side, can we start with the interview?
Sure. You can.
So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's interview with Dr. Kohinoor Darda. We're going to be discussing family dynamics and their influence on the socio-cognitive development of children. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Darda. She's a cognitive neuroscientist who is the founder director of Harissa Foundation. She's also a classical dancer, a triathlete, and someone who's known for balancing a multitude of passions in combining some of them through her organization. She's an alumna of Ferguson College, where she did her undergraduate, after which she completed her master's in clinical psychology from Bangor University. She's also held research positions at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Glasgow, and has multiple ongoing research projects in collaborations with top universities. Welcome, ma'am, and we are very glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the interview.
Yeah. So, to start off, could you discuss the role of family dynamics on the development of a child's social and cognitive abilities?
Yeah, so goes without saying. I mean, family is someone that we spend the most time with as kids, right? Growing up, most of us, not everyone obviously has the same background, but usually it's the people around us, like the primary caregivers, that we spend the most time with. So it's super important for the child's development growing up that the family around is functional and stable. And that could be defined in multiple ways, and we can go in more detail in that. But for any kid's social or emotional or even motor development, if there is no person to help with stimulation, there is no person to help with reciprocity, with attachment. So many different factors go into this. Like it's a very broad question. But goes without saying that the child's development will be impacted if family dynamics are not set up in a way that's conducive to the nurture of the child. So some of the, I mean, we do a lot of work in like early childhood experience. We do some research on that, especially in the zone of adoption and how kids live in childcare institutions. Um, and you can see a marked difference in how when they are in a group care setting where maybe their needs are not met, or when babies are crying out or want comfort, and that need of comfort is not met. Um, the development, like there are differences in brain structure that actually happen. So it's not just just at a superficial level, but there are neurobiological changes that happen. And there is also developmental delay in a lot of the kids that you then see growing up because they've not had the comfort, because they've not had secure attachment, because they've not had the right kind of stimulation. That doesn't mean that these things can't be reversed. So when the adopted kids, for example, get placed in a family and the family contributes to the love and nurture of the kids, you can see that they play cognitive. You can see that there is immense development in their cognitive abilities. And by the time they are a little older or teenagers, they are they're essentially their cognitive functioning and their social functioning is similar to a kid who has been raised in a functional, loving family from the beginning. And so any kind of family dynamic, um, whether that's separation between the parents, whether that's um, not a healthy environment in the house, um, all of that tends to affect our brains at a very neurobiological level. Again, these changes are plastic. Like our brain is plastic, so these changes are reversible. But for a lot of people, if you're already living in a dysfunctional family, it is possible that um, that dysfunctional family doesn't suddenly switch to becoming functional over time. Right? And all of that kind of affects your development leading into adulthood, leading into how your brains function in adulthood. So yeah, I mean, again, there's a lot there in terms of attachment and flight of response and how your brain cells are then more attuned to getting more stressed or more anxious. in adulthood because of certain event experiences in childhood. But we can go into those details later. But hopefully, like broadly, this answers your question.
So you talked about how the family dynamics that are present, and especially the involvement of the primary caregiver, affects the kind of people that the children grow up to become. So more specifically, could you talk about how the dynamics between the parents themselves model or reinforce, especially certain social norms, like let's say gender roles or conflict resolution or communication styles?
Yeah, great question. Again, I'm not an expert on that because my research and a social setting of childcare institutions or what we also know as orphanages. But what I can definitely say from my research and from my limited knowledge on the topic is any unstable environment, right? Like any imbalance in how parents behave with each other will impact the child. When you talk about gender roles, kids learn to imitate at a very young age. I have a 1 year old and she picks up things like this. It's crazy. For me, it's like insane. My PhD is on automatic imitation and copying behaviors. And for me, it's amazing to see how quickly she picks up things, right? I make a sound, and the next minute she's already making that sound. And these are like tough sounds to make, right? Like, or like a goldfish face, or anything that I do are modeling behavior that are not healthy, the kid is going to learn those behaviors which are not healthy. If parents are modeling roles that are stereotypical for the gender, the kid is going to think if their exposure to the world is limited also because as kids again your primary world becomes the parents. Then as you get a bit older, then it's your social kind of friend circle and then your schools and your teachers and society. But primarily the people you see for the most amount of time are going to be your primary caregiver. That could be parents, grandparents, whoever is your primary caregiver. And if they are modeling behaviors which are either unhealthy or to reinforce certain social norms or roles, that's what the kid's going to start learning to believe in. So we're all, neurally wired to have like a maybe in-group, out-group perspective. Like we all do categorization in our brains, right? Like this is mine, that is yours. That's something that's neurally wired in us. But what becomes mine and what becomes yours, or what becomes the in-group and what becomes the out-group is all merged. It's what you learn through your growing up stages. So even though the brain might make this distinction, it is possible to change what becomes your in-group and out-group as well, or what you consider as gender norms and how that can change. But if the parents are modeling that behavior, it's going to trickle down the birth.
So you mentioned in brief about how if your needs are not being met, that kind of hampers or impacts your development. So what are some signs that dysfunctional family dynamics may be impacting a child's development, and in what way do they prevent?
Yeah, so again, this is so different because every child is different. So it's very hard to say these are definitely the signs that will work. And also many times, I mean, you're students of psychology, so you know that there are a lot of other factors such as spectrum disorders, learning disorders, attention disorders, autism, everything that we speak of in developmental psychology, which may or may not be related to the nurture you've had. Right. So if you see certain signs, they could be because of underlying factors that are unrelated to the nurture that you're getting from your primary caregivers. Um, but if needs are not met, you can see that the children start becoming isolated. They start retreating into themselves, for example, or you can see their confidence getting affected, their sense of identity getting affected, their response to different things in the environment can get affected to something that doesn't have to cause anxiety in typical cases might cause them anxiety because their response to stress or response to stressors is elevated. Um, because you can imagine very simply put, if a baby is in a childcare home, for example, and cries out to have his or her their needs met, and no one comes to soothe them, they learn to self-soothe, right? But they're only learning this over a period of time. They're not learning to do it immediately. And once they self-soothe, um, their kind of expectation of the world is then, okay, no one's coming to help me. I have to deal with this people. Whereas we don't usually walk into the world thinking of that. We are, inherently social beings. We like to get help from multiple sources. We ask for help in a lot of cases, even though we think like we could, do this independently or whatever. Um, and we know if, like, for example, I have a good relationship with my primary caregiver, my parents, and I say, okay, I need help. I'm in a situation. They will come to help, and I have that assurance. So before I get into a difficult or a risky situation, I already have the assurance that if I don't do this well or if I get into any trouble, someone's there to have my back. Whereas if you don't get that anything and don't bond or don't have that attachment or assurance from their primary caregiver, will have heightened levels of stress in circumstances like these, where there is a risky situation maybe, or there is uncertainty or confusion. Could be at a very small level, it doesn't have to be a big thing, right? Um, and that could lead to a lot of things also growing up in their childhood development, in interacting with each other, in their social life. Um, but yeah, I mean, these are some of the things that you can watch out for if family dynamics are dysfunctional, if children's needs are not met. Emotional expression also is affected. So how they will then assert themselves is affected. How they will emote or like what expressions they give, how they express themselves, that can be affected. Um, there could be developmental delays also, but again, you always see the part whether it's nurture or whether it's an inherent condition that they might have.
So, with regard to the needs being met, how do joint and nuclear families differ in their influence, especially on a child's social skills? And is one structure more preferred or better for the development of the child?
Yeah, that's again a good question. But what I would say is I think we look at it as a very dichotomous thing, that joint family, nuclear family, Um, my belief and a lot of research now also points to the fact that it takes a village to raise a child. And this is a belief we've had for times immemorial, right? Um, and why I say that is because even if you might be a nuclear family, you might have a community that contributes to the upbringing and nurture of the child. And that community becomes the village that then raises the child. So you could have access to even something like daycare could be a community. You might have access to a really good daycare, and that becomes your community. So it's quite popular, for example, let's say in the Western world, especially in the rich Western world, you have really good daycares, and people like both the parents might be working and the kids go to daycare and learn a lot of things and get a lot of stimulation and a lot of exposure, are taken care of very well, etc., etc. Um, with joint families, like in a nuclear family, if you have this kind of a setting, that's really good for the child, right? Like you have still a village raising the child. In a joint family, in a lot of cases, if there's more people and everyone's aligned on the vision of how they want to bring up the child and how they want to nurture the child, again, really good situation to be in, right? The kid has multiple people looking after them. The usually now, again, this is stereotypical, but usually it's the mother who gets overwhelmed with the parenting duties. Whether that's because of the feeding, whether that's because of household chores that need to happen, whether that's because baby like caregiving is considered to be a woman's job, etc., etc. Lots of reasons again. But in a joint family setup, at least there is some taking away of that responsibility. And again, this is both research saying it. This is also my personal experience, where I live with my grandparents, parents, brothers, and if I have to go somewhere or attend a call, for example, someone else takes care of the child, and there is that distance then that's created where you're not 24/7 responsible for a small human being. Um, and for the development of the child gets very different perspective, right? So the child is getting love from multiple sources, they're getting nurture from multiple sources. What can happen in a joint family setup is if people are not aligned in their vision of how they want to bring up the child, or if they don't get along in the first place. This can also happen in a nuclear family between partners. But if the dynamics are such that the partners may be aligned, but their parents or cousins or whoever lives in that joint family setup may not be aligned with the same nurturing vision that they might have, a parenting direction that they might have for the child could get confused. So they don't know which approach to follow, they don't know who to answer. And if there are then fights between the two parties, that might also impact the child because the child might be forced to take sides sometimes. The child will feel guilty about taking someone's side that they want to take. Again, multiple very small examples that I can give. So the ideal, I don't think the question should be like joint or nuclear. It's functional or dysfunctional. And both nuclear and joint families have their pros and cons. And both can work really well in when all the positive conditions are met.
That's an interesting perspective. And you also mentioned like children in maybe orphanages or stuff, which is it can definitely be a lot different for them than someone in a typical family model. So can you talk about that or the other non-traditional models like queer families or single parenting? How does the child's socialization differ or impacted by that?
Right. Again, really good question. So, in terms of, I'll answer the first part of the question first. At the childcare home, usually in a childcare home, you are in a group care setting. In the sense that you have, let's say, 10 children and you have three people taking care of 10 children, right? You usually don't have one-on-one attention. You usually are one of many, so you're not given any extra attention or any special treatment. Um, when you move from that kind of a setting to a family, suddenly you have all the attention, right? So that change also impacts the child's development. In a group care setting, in childcare institutions, not that you're not, I mean, there are a lot of good childcare institutions where you will be taken care of, but you will not have the opportunity to develop a special bond like you would with a primary caregiver. Also, you will have probably moushis on shift. Someone takes care of the child from 9 to 6, someone takes care of the child from 6 to 5 in the morning, whatever. There will be shifts in which people will come. So, if you develop attachment, it will be for a particular time period and repeated by someone else for a particular time period and will never be the same as being part of a family where you are the only kid or you are one of maybe two or three kids. Here you are 10, 15, 20 sometimes, and then only two or three caregivers. So that dynamic definitely impacts, like I said initially, as well, your socio-cognitive development in terms of your social skills, emotional skills, executive functioning. Um, but it's because children are so plastic, especially, and even adults are, but children especially are so plastic, they will eventually play catch up once they're in a nurturing environment. So it's not like um, nowhere at all am I saying that being part of a childcare institution means that you will be behind. What I'm trying to say is that you won't get the same love and nurture that you would in a family, and therefore every kid deserves a family, um, but also like a functional family. Uh, and the impact that the brain has because of your adverse experiences in childhood, whether that's because you were not comforted, your needs were not met, you didn't have access to primary resources, basic needs, etc., etc. The neurobiological changes are still quite strong. So they will trickle into adulthood unless you are aware because of allowing and nurturing environment. But there is ways of also dealing with that baggage, of taking therapy, of you know as adults also reversing, adults also identifying those thought patterns and trying to change them. That's one. The other part of your question was about queer and single parent families. And as a single parent, I can also say, but also based on now, there's a lot of research in this context, but also from the Western context, unfortunately, there's very limited research in the Indian context. Um, but essentially, kids, because they're so um, plastic, because they're so malleable, because they're like a sponge, they're sucking in all the information. It's what you expose them to that drives their socializing, that drives their sense of identity, that drives their sense of confidence. And primarily, we cannot control everything that you expose your child to. Obviously, it's incomplete because eventually they're going to go out and get exposed to everything. But what you can kind of start with um, is exposing them to different kinds of families in the first place. The second thing is you try to imbibe the values. I mean, all you can do is imbibe the values of critical reasoning, right? Like the child then grows up to make independent decisions for themselves without your decisions kind of burdening on them or your thought process burdening on them. Like if I want my girl, my daughter to, I don't know, to raise as a feminist, I can't just expose her feminist knowledge because that means when she grows up, she'll also get access to other. I can't control the world that she lives with, right? Like she might get access to a lot of different kinds of things. What I can teach her do is how to assimilate that knowledge and be able to make decisions for herself based on the other things that she's getting and all that. And so, with also queer and single parent families, I think again it comes down to every village, like every kid needs a village. Um, and your villages or your chosen families can look very different. They don't have to be a typical setup of my parents, my siblings, my whatever. It could be friends who are your chosen family. It could be your community, your society, whoever, anyone who forms a part of this village. Which is also why, like in social psychology, we have a lot of now research coming up about communities and community psychology and how communities together can help with the development of children. We have a lot of research in homeschooling and schooling communities that really thrive compared to traditional schooling models because there is a sense of community coming together to do something that is useful. And there is also a lot of research on the children really thrive when they also learn with people of different ages, not of the same age. Because every child's development is very different. And so you will have, I mean, you can read a lot of research, there's a lot of articles and there's also a lot of videos now that come up on Instagram as well about this, about children learning in setups that are not traditional. And the reason that also helps is because they're fairly community driven. And they're fairly kind of experiential in nature. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Definitely. I feel like every child needs a village, and that is, I think, takes some of the stress off from the primary caregivers as well. So their life goes on even after having a child. So a community really helps. Coming to dysfunctional families, can you talk about the concept of a parentified child? I think you mentioned it briefly before. How does being a parentified child impact one's social cognitive development, especially when they are probably growing up in high stress housing?
What child? Sorry.
The parentified child. So, like you said, if there is conflict between caregivers or conflict between how to do the child has to decide. And if the child has the younger siblings, then kind of they can model after their parents and turn into like a caregiver for their younger siblings. So, in that sense,
So how that impacts their social development? Is that
having to be emotionally there, having to censor yourself, to be emotionally there for your parents or for younger siblings, how can that impact
yeah,
their health?
yeah, again, lots of research in this about how children who learn to self-feed or whose needs are met or who become responsible at a younger age, essentially they're losing out on childhood, right? Like they are becoming adults at a younger age. And again, very interesting research actually about, I'm trying to remember the name of the research, it's not coming to my head, but I can tell you the papers about how brain structure changes for these kids. And children's brains actually start looking more like adult brains. So neurobiologically, again, you have this step um, that children don't take of growing into their adulthood, but immediately get into adulthood. And that step, like those neurobiological changes, impact your day-to-day life in many different ways. The same thing that I said before, also like the fight or flight response gets activated way faster. Like you are in a constant mode of, okay, this is a stressor, I need to deal with it. This is a stressor, I need to deal with it. Um, and that dealing may not always happen in like a resilient way, right? Because you're always on high arousal mode, you're always in a trigger mode. Um, the cortisol also acts up. So essentially, all your hormones are also playing against you, right? You're constantly in a position of being stressed out, even in small situations. And that's one of the things that can get impacted. And also then we have other things such as, if you are constantly taking care of the parents, eventually, if you aren't able to distance yourself, you are going to keep again, I mean, there's so many different factors playing in this, right? There's also your sense of worth becomes attached to who you take care of. And if then that person, especially it happens with a younger sibling, right? Like if I take care of my younger sibling, eventually there might be a point where the younger sibling may not need me. Then what happens to my sense of worth? And if that happens sooner rather than when I'm that are able to deal with it, that impacts my relationship in across, like outside of my relationship with my siblings. Right? So my sense of worth then always becomes taking care of someone. And that may not be a healthy relationship to have in the first place. Like I don't need to be responsible for someone 24/7. And if that, and then that would impact my relationship, let's say, with my partner. And then that parent relationship, that partner relationship that I might have will impact how I parent my kids. So again, there are trickle down effects of how one thing might lead to another. But again, these are very specific examples, and there are many factors that play a role in it. But the bottom line is, when you ask the question about kids taking responsibilities, you also see this pattern in a lot of kids who've undergone adverse childhood experiences of many different kinds, that their brains start looking a bit more like adult brains than they should look like typically developing children's brains. And looking like an adult brain is not a good thing, because also adults with five, the brain starts kind of slowing down in their brain. And there is more neurodegeneration than there is regeneration. So that's not a good thing for kids to become adults.
Even though we know that and research has been done on how it's not a good sign to become adults when you're children, we still applaud maturity as children, in children. And even from adults, you're given that sort of validation that, oh, you're so mature for your age, and that's seen as a compliment, and that's given as a compliment. So other than that maturity which we're applauding, are there any other ways in which parents or teachers or caregivers can recognize when a child's development is impacted by family issues? And what types of intervention do you think are most effective and most practical in helping children in these situations?
Yeah. Again, I'm not an expert in this, so my limited knowledge is what I can definitely talk about. In terms of interventions, I think taking help is step one, and I think also parents seeking help is really important. So, like primary caregivers, um, because when the child is really young and you see certain signs in the child that you might think are not the sign of, let's say, a healthy or a typically developing, insert the right politically correct word because all the words are not really the right words to use, but insert whatever word, if the parents have like a feeling that okay, something has changed and it's in the negative, the first thing parents usually or primary caregivers usually need to do is evaluate whether their own like their identities, their relationships, their way of like dealing with problems and situations is something that they need help for, or if their life is something where they would benefit from counseling or therapy. And that I think it's still not widespread enough in our culture yet that parents will freely ask for help and will, because usually what tends to happen, this is also parents who come to me at Arisa who are like, hey, my kid is a little falling behind in so and so, or is not as social, is very, very shy. Can you suggest something? And we can say, okay, we have certain workshops, so we have art therapy and movement therapy for kids, and it's known to help with this and help with that. But no parent has ever come to us and said, hey, we think our child is delayed in this. What can we do, and how can we better ourselves to make it easier for our children? And it doesn't come from a place of, oh, like, anything bad for the child. It's just that something you don't think of in the first place, right? So I would say the first intervention would have to happen with the primary caregivers. And then you have many different options. I mean, you have other experts who can talk better about this with children. Um, but in terms of intervention, there's so many workshops, therapies, play therapy, art therapy that works really well, especially with trauma, with children who aren't able to verbalize their feelings. Using art works as a really good medium, and we've seen this in a lot of our research and a lot of research that I've read up on art-based therapy, because you're not talking, you're not verbalizing. Because not all kids can verbalize their emotions and what they're feeling really, really well. All these non-verbal therapies also help with kind of overcoming fears, dealing with challenges, um, and any of these kind of blocks. In terms of signs that you can see, like I mentioned before, isolation, not expressing themselves, being a bit detached from things that they usually used to like, maybe, or like not making friends or not being responsive at home. Again, so many different factors affect all of these signs that it's very hard for me to say this is because parents are not doing a good job or whatever, it's there are too many factors that play with all of these signs together.
And so coming to parenting styles, gentle parenting is a growing concept and many people have adopted it. But there are some critics who argue that it might lead to soft or weak individuals who are not ready for the real world. So how valid do you think these concerns are and what is your perspective on gentle parenting?
You're asking for my like personal opinion. I mean, I think general parenting is great. It's essentially the idea that empathy forms the biggest part of gentle parenting as opposed to punishment. And it's respect for the child as an adult, almost that you would give, like respect you would give an adult, right? A lot of times we tend to overlook children's race, thinking, okay, he's just a child or she's just a child. What will they know? Um, and we forget that they also have needs of their own and an ability to understand logic and rationality to a certain extent. Um, and so for me, if you're asking my personal opinion, I think gentle parenting is great. Um, there is a lot of criticism. One being that it's fully like it could be very child focused and very child centered. There's a lot of backlash on discipline and maybe like general parenting means there's no discipline. Or like we said that they need to soft children and children just need to buckle up and deal with the world like we did. But we see a lot of like our parents' generation who actually didn't have gentle parenting really struggle to deal with stressors. And so, if someone comes to me with these critics, usually always say, hey, you have to deal with so much baggage. I'm hoping that even if my kids stop, that they will face challenges without that baggage, or at least with different baggage. There's no right way of parenting. Whatever works best for you. And the kid will also respond. I mean, the good part about gentle parenting is because it's child centered that the kid responds and they just learn to understand their things. Um, Again, this is all said and done in theory. It's not very practical for a lot of people. And I totally understand that. I think it's also a thing of privilege. Um, but there are certain principles of gentle parenting that, irrespective of privilege, will apply to your life and to your parenting, whichever approach you decide to take. So all of that said, I'm interesting again for my personal opinion, also research based. And there's tons of research that shows that parenting with empathy and respect are more like is far better for the child's development than its punishment.
People kind of confuse gentle parenting as permissive parenting also, which is like an important distinction to make.
Yeah.
And personally, if it comes to like you being ready for the real world, if you teach conflict management and stress management, and if you kind of allow the children to feel safe and kind of tell them that they are always there for you, I think gentle parenting works.
And it's super contextual as well. And I think it's so, I think also any kind of parenting, whether then that you give different names, but especially with gentle parenting, it's super important. Like it depends on implementation. Right? Like what kind of implementation do you do of that parenting? If it lacks clear boundaries or if it involves being permissive all the time, it actually might go the other way where it hinders a child's ability to be resilient or to be able to self-control. The kid might feel like they're losing their volition. Um, and the same way, like because you mentioned permissive parenting as well, if there are no boundaries, to the gentle parenting as well. The emotional dysregulation that you might have can be quite high. So that also like the implementation matters so much. And when I say child centered, it doesn't have to be child centered to the point that the parents forget themselves or the primary caregivers forget themselves. So I think that's also super key. Like in the process of gentle parenting, if the primary caregivers forget their own like taking care of themselves, then that also impacts the child's development.
Absolutely. There's a lot of research on caregivers' burden as well, and if they are not in the right headspace, then there's only so much that they'll be able to give. But with respect to these new perspectives, not just research wise, but now parenting styles are being more talked about. So, how do you think society's perspective on parenting has evolved more, especially over the last few decades? And are there any specific changes that you believe are still necessary to better support children's development? And this is obviously very fairly subjective, but yeah.
Yeah, so there's definitely a change, right? I mean, again, these are things that are related a lot to privilege, to access to information, to where in the world you're situated, what community you live in, what society you're a part of, what, etc., right? But on an average, what you see is like this a kind of a bit of a cycle almost. So there is a like today there is more just a step towards understanding parenting. People want like primary caregivers want to know how my child's going to develop, what are the milestones I should be tracking, um, what are the ways I can facilitate their development, what are the different things I can do to facilitate that development. And in the process, what happens also is because we have too much access to information, that can also hinder sometimes what kind of information comes to us because there's no filter that you can put. So that means all information is now coming in, and we are struggling to understand what is the right kind of information, right? So a lot of parents, and I think my friend who's she's also from Ferguson, she might be a good person to interview, Krishna Kulkarni, Dr. Krishna Kulkarni. I don't know if you know her.
We do, and we will be calling her in.
Okay, perfect. So she's the perfect person to speak about this. I am really not, because her PhD is parent-child play, and she does a lot of work on how play helps sensory development, motor development, etc. And she counsels parents or like talks to parents and consults with them about child development. So she would be the perfect person to talk about this more than me. She's an expert at this. But what I can definitely say from my limited experience um, is that people usually tend to um, like parents usually want to do better and in the process actually do too much. And I think there needs to be a balance between too much and too little. And it's also like the second thing to that is the more you allow the child to be, the better it is for the parent as well. Because like if a child is stumbling and trying to like walk its path, you let them instead of saying, I mean, you see all these videos also now on Instagram, or maybe I just see them because they come on my algorithm because I'm a parent. But there are all these videos of kids climbing trees and the parents going like, "Oh, be careful, you will fall." So we are the ones instilling fear in them, whereas kids don't come born with fear. Yeah. But then if you say something like, "Okay, I hope you've seen where you're going, and do you know what's below? And do you think you're, you know, if the foot's on a particular stone, you want to let them express, but if they are slipping and falling, you're there to catch them. So that like distancing, but also being there, that balance is such a thin line. I don't think everyone gets it perfectly done all the time. But I think that movement of too much information went to like a little bit of helicopter parenting, of being there constantly around children, constantly wanting to control all aspects of life. Um, what could definitely help is more data-backed, research-driven, like information that's out there in a palatable form for the public to understand. That's where Krishna's work also comes in because she gives really tailored um, interventions for children. And I think people like her and others working in this space do a lot now in terms of communicating science behind parenting. What are the neurobiological things that are happening in the brain, and what are the social emotional development? What's research saying about it? And again, just this idea of being aware of the children's cues. Like this was also new to me as a parent when I read about it, but it's also the one that makes most sense for my parenting journey. And I think every parent will have their own like set of things that they need to follow. Um, but just like being responsive to cues and trusting. intuition, and also then making use of all the research-backed evidence that you might have collected in that journey. A balance of that and being able to assimilate that together, I think that would be the need of the hour. Um, a little bit of filtering of all the over information you get. So that would be the need of the hour in my opinion.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There are okay, go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there are so many times when people try so hard, or the parents try so hard not to be a certain way. Like maybe if someone has very absent parents, they might end up becoming helicopter parents. So as you rightly mentioned, finding that balance is really important. Yeah.
Okay, so these were all the questions from our side, but we also have a couple of questions sent in by students. So now we'll proceed with those. Firstly, this is a heavier topic, but what is the impact of physical violence in the house, or maybe towards or in front of the child?
Yeah, so again goes back to what I talked about trauma, and adverse childhood experiences. Violence, physical or emotional, is one of the most traumatic incidences that, or like traumatic experiences that a child might have growing up, whether that's towards them, whether that's towards another person. Um, and it could be caused by multiple things, right? It could be caused by individual factors, or it could be caused by family dynamics, or could be like cultural factors where for discipline you are hit, and that's thought to be common. It's not something like not maybe like a domestic violence thing that they're experiencing, but they're being hit because they are not following certain rules or whatever. The impact is, I mean, it's manifold, right? Like, obviously, there is physical impact, but there is emotional impact in terms of the fight or flight response, stress levels, anxiety, depression, self esteem, identity, inability to form healthy relationships growing up. That also impacts like academic performance, social like friendships, isolation, loneliness. I mean, I'm just listing words, but essentially all of these are impacted by trauma. And all of these, and trauma is in multiple forms, but especially when it comes to violence. Um, One, because children model behaviors, if they see one parent hit the other, they are going to learn the same behavior, and they are going to think that this is an acceptable form of treating someone else. Um, or it could be where they are trying to save the other like partner, and if they're slightly older kids as well, and in the process either get affected themselves or always have this feeling of, hey, I need to care for my parent, whereas they don't feel cared for. So again, this idea of kids becoming adult like or more adults in their childhood, losing out on their childhood. I mean, the sense of security is something I think that we all take for granted if we've not had a childhood where that sense of security has been taken away from us. And then growing up, that impacts so many of our life decisions, whether that's professional, personal, whether that's um, again like talking to other people, that's social, partner related, parent related. There's cycles of abuse that impact then the future generations as well. So neurobiologically, again, there are a lot of changes in the brain that happen. Your prefrontal cortex gets affected, which means your cognitive functioning gets affected. Your impulse behaviors get affected. You could be more impulsive in certain situations, more risk taking, in the negative sense of the word, not like in, oh, I take it risks and I get over them, but you indulge in more behaviors, um, leading to a lot of other harmful behaviors like addictive, delinquent behavior. Um, Again, not to say these changes cannot be reversed, but growing up in such an environment means that you have certain neurobiological changes that will have taken place that you will have to work really, really hard to then get away from. And no one would wish that kind of an environment on a child.
Mm. Now, we talked about parental conflict, but what about when the parental conflict is followed by a sudden return to normalcy? Because the child may be viewing whatever rash words are being spoken, but may not be a part of the making up and is not aware of, okay, so now everything's gone back to normal. So when the parents expect the child to forget and move on, and this is a cyclic thing, then how does it impact the child?
Yeah, so in this case, because this is a specific example that you just pointed out, right? One thing that happens usually is because, like you rightly said, the child is not part of the making up process. So the child has only seen a conflict. The
Right.
child has not seen the resolution of that conflict, and now the child is expected to forget that the conflict ever happened in the first place and that they were impacted by it. So what that has done to the child is invalidated what the child feels, because now suddenly what the child feels does not exist and shouldn't be talked about, because the problem that had started what the child feels in the first place has been forgotten about. And in that case, the impact again, for, like, let's say, the shorter term is this invalidation, right? Is this like, okay, maybe it's not important. What I feel is not important in this case also. The long term kind of impact is also stress and anxiety and self blame, particularly in younger children. That, okay, maybe I caused this and it's not there anymore, but now I'm unsure if I'm going to cause it again, and I don't want to cause it again. So there's a lot of insecurity that also, again, long term can lead to identity, like issues of self identity and um, self esteem and confidence and a lot of emotional confusion, um, so on and so forth. And then the other thing that kind of is, or what could be done, is actually for parents to talk to the child and communicate to the child, right? Like, so communication then becomes a key part. And what if this communication doesn't happen? What that shows is that within the family there is limited communication about conflict resolution. And so growing up, kids again have issues in terms of how to actually resolve conflicts, right? And might end up in similar situations with other people instead of solving those conflicts as well. And again, I mean, again, lots of other factors play a role in this, but then you have, aggression, withdrawal, and again, all kinds of other things that could play into this, but very contextual again. So, or even, I mean, people call children rebels, but like rebels can be born also out of certain things like this. So, depends. Really contextual.
Right. So those are all the questions from our side. Is there anything else that you would like to add or speak about?
Nothing in particular. I would say, as a new mom, I just say always, like, I think it's partly just figuring it out as you go.
So then that we'll conclude this very insightful interview. Thank you so much for touching upon this very necessary but less talked about topic. And there are definitely lots of varying opinions about how parenting should and shouldn't be, and how children should and shouldn't be, without really taking into consideration how that parenting would actually have an impact on the children, and how childhood experiences really have an impact on how children see the world even as adults. So, thank you once again for taking out the time and being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And please let me know when you do finally publish it. So I will also take it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
Good luck with all your interviews.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
ma'am.
Bye.
It was wonderful talking to you.
Yeah, same here.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. Have a nice day.
Bye. You too.
Bye.
Nice day.